Let's continue our study of Genesis 2 to 10 by focusing on the historical context. At this point, we want to be aware of similar material that we find outside the Bible. We call this extra-biblical. So, for example, in Genesis 2, we're introduced to something known as the Tree of Life. If we go to ancient Assyria, we find this particular structure, this particular plant that's described as the Tree of Life. This comes from Assyria. And you see an emperor, an Assyrian emperor, before it, Ashurbanipal. An interesting parallel, isn't it? That they knew of, or had in their lore, mention of some plant, some tree that had properties that were life-giving. What about the account in Genesis 3 where we find that there is a serpent, there's an opportunity to have life that's unending if they were to eat of the tree of life, but the actions of the serpent interfere with that, and this privilege, this opportunity is removed from them. Again, Mesopotamian material, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is an ancient flood account. And one of the episodes within that, there's a particular hero. This hero learns that if he is strong enough to get to the bottom of a well, a water well, and retrieve from there a magical plant and then consume it, then he would live forever. He manages to retrieve that plant at great effort, and while he's resting back up on topside on the ground, alongside the well, along comes an animal and snatches that magical, life-giving plant away. That animal is a serpent. An interesting parallel. Continuing with the historical context, we have flood accounts in materials coming from the Nile Valley, Egyptian material. So, for example, in an account of the gods Re and Hathor, there is a particular flood which threatens to destroy mankind. In Sumerian materials, a particular king by the name of Ziusudra survives a flood. This account from Sumeria is known as the Deluge. And finally, Babylonian material, we've referred a moment ago to the Epic of Gilgamesh with regard to the magical plant and the serpent who snatched it away. Well, that same Epic of Gilgamesh is even better known for a hero by the name of Utnapishtim who survives a flood. This is a fragmentary tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The writing here is cuneiform. So we want to be aware that in ancient literature outside the Bible, we find occasionally some intriguing parallels. I should mention that in the Epic of Gilgamesh, there is a high degree of a similarity when it comes to the dispatching of birds in order to determine whether or not the soil is dry enough for humans to disembark. A high degree of similarity between that and the Noah account. Continuing with the historical context, we want to be aware that when God established the rainbow following the flood, the positioning of it, that is to say the fact that the open end of the rainbow faces down, according to Von Rad, he suggests that this orientation of the shape would have communicated to persons in the ancient world a weapon of hostility that has been set at rest. So a bow, as in bow and arrow, but it's not in an active orientation, not upright, ready to fire an arrow, but rather it is at rest. If he is right, then the orientation of the rainbow would have conveyed peace, a cessation of hostilities to the ancient viewer. Our next collection of insights of a historical sort leave the ancient Near East entirely but go to another ancient culture, the culture of China, and examine some of the symbols used in their writing, the components of which are very intriguing. Take, for example, this first word. It's a cluster of symbols comprised of the symbol for tree, and there are two of them. Underneath it, the symbol for a woman. This is a composite word, two trees above a woman. The meaning of the composite word is covet. It makes one wonder why, as the Chinese people were seeking to convey in pictograph or ideograph the notion of coveting, why would they bring in two trees and a woman? Intriguing parallel to the biblical account in the garden. Tree again, in fact, again, a pair of them. And then combined with an independent character that means reveal. When these three are drawn together, then it means ban or a prohibition. So a revelation that takes place in the context of a couple of trees. That sort of revelation is a ban or a prohibition. Striking comparison to the fact that when there were two particular trees in the Garden of Eden, that was the occasion for God to reveal something that he wanted them to do, a statement, and that revelation was in the form of something they must not do, eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Consider what happens in the Chinese language when we introduce this character for reveal together with the verb to speak or speech. When these occur together, this is the expression for God. Again, a compound word meaning God. The process of revelation through speech. The next composite word includes the word for a vessel, that is a watercraft, the number 8, and the symbol for a mouth. When you put these together, a vessel, the numeral 8, and a mouth, that is the word for a boat. Now, why is it that the Chinese in ancient times would have conveyed the idea of boat with 8 persons, the idea of mouth that can represent an individual, 8 individuals on the boat? Think back a moment to the number of persons in the ark. Noah and his wife, Noah's 3 sons, and their respective wives. So 2 plus 6, 8. Remarkable parallel to the census of persons on Noah's ark. Why would it be that the Chinese would create a water vessel, a figure for a water vessel that would have this sort of detail to it? Unless perhaps they were aware in some remote memory of that story. Here's another one that may interest you. The symbol on the left is water. This is a cover. Once again, the numeral 8, and as we've seen before, a tree. When these come together as a composite, the meaning is deep. Water with a cover over 8 above a tree, as if spatially these 8 with a protective covering over them are located even above the top of trees in the environment of water. It sounds like it fits with the ark, its 8 human inhabitants who are floating above the treetops. Now, granted, this is a speculative connection, and yet it's intriguing, and it must not be ignored. That is, these general connections between Chinese ideographs and accounts in the Hebrew Bible. Some may be wondering whether or not these Chinese characters were the result of contact with missionaries who brought Bibles with them, and then the Chinese developed their writing, influenced by exposure to missionary activity. We can assure you that the development of Chinese writing came much, much earlier than any such missionary activity, centuries earlier. Let's take up the puzzle, which has been observed and discussed at length. It has to do with the possibility of varying sources contributing to the biblical material. This discussion acknowledges that within the first creation account of chapter 1, second creation account of chapter 2, there's not a complete match between these. We're not just saying that varied information is presented, but some information appears to be at odds. For example, in the first account, humans are the last animals to be created. Other animals have been created earlier. Whereas in the second account, it seems that when Adam's need for a helper is identified at that point, then God brings forth the animals as if it were creating them then and not before then. People have puzzled over this and proposed a couple of possibilities. For one, perhaps there are different sources. That is to say, literary sources, which then would have been the product of memory sources, communities that had stories of creation that were different. So perhaps there was a northern Israel story and a southern Israel story. And at some point, these were collected together, both respected and appreciated, so they wanted to preserve them, put side by side in the book of Genesis. This is the documentary theory or source theory. There are other understandings of this, and they have to do with what is the intention of a given episode or portion. I'm impressed increasingly with the fact that the ancients would have been aware of these differences. They were not sloppy readers. They understood this material much better than we did. They would have seen the discontinuities, and yet it must not have bothered them. That is to say, they were not expecting the literature to perform in a particular way, that is, historic exact match, shall we say. That was not a criterion of theirs which would be used to measure the worth of a particular passage. They seem not to be troubled with it. They just go ahead and include it. And so rather than asking, is one story accurate or a different story accurate, maybe we should be asking a different question and try to appreciate them in the environment in which they are presented, appreciate them as the ancient reader would have appreciated them, asking what is the contribution of this story, not does it exactly match another one. We want then to caution ourselves against forcing the text to perform other than it's really intended. It's sort of like trying to push a nail in with a screwdriver. A screwdriver is not intended to perform that way. We should use a hammer instead. We need to be careful of assuming that a part of the Bible is intended to perform in a particular way when maybe that's not what it was designed for. We want to use materials as originally designed. Let's go a little bit deeper in this idea of multiple sources. Two of the sources that have been proposed, and there are fundamentally four. One is the E source, which stands for the word Elohim. And in its simplest explanation, this would describe parts of the Old Testament, particularly in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, parts where the dominant reference to God is by the Hebrew word Elohim, customarily translated God. In contrast to this would be what's come to be known as the J source, J for Yahweh. Why isn't it the Y source? Well, good question. It's because in German scholarship, German biblical scholarship of old, the Yahweh, the Yahweh name of God, was written first with a J, J-A-H, and pronounced Yahweh. So it's that little German J equals a Y sound that's caused this to be called the J source, or the Yahweh source, the Yahwistic source. Similar to the Elohim source, in this case, a passage would be characterized as a Yahwistic source if its principal reference to God is with the Yahweh name of God, the I Am. And you see some passages from particularly the flood account where there'll be a string of verses that are Elohistic and then a break. 6:9 to 22 Elohistic, but then when we come down to chapter 7 verse 1, first 5 verses Yahwistic, and then at verse 5 a switch back to Elohistic until 19, and then a switch back to 20. Except, by the way, that Yahweh is embedded in the Elohistic, otherwise Elohistic passage of 7:6 to 19. You notice that verse 16, within that 6 to 19 spin, there's a reference to God as Yahweh. Let's take a look at how that would appear. We're looking at the left here at Genesis 7 from New Revised Standard. Genesis 7 verse 16, we have a reference to the divine being as God, and that's consistent with other parts of this passage that would identify this portion, according to source critics, as being Elohistic. But within that same verse, just another phrase later, we have reference to the divine being as Lord. This is the word Yahweh, the personal name of God, so that would make this half of the verse Yahwistic. Notice how it reads. And those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God commanded him, that is, commanded Noah, and the Lord shut him in, that is, closed the ark so that it would be secure. It's remarkable here that there's a shift from Elohim to Yahweh within the same verse. This is unusual. And it's caused some to say that the Elohistic source would cover this much and resume afterward, so on. But then right within it, just one phrase of Yahwistic, as if it came as a hybrid coming in from a different literary source, a different memory of the same story. This is one example that makes me reluctant to find the documentary hypothesis a real persuasive explanation for the composition of the Hebrew Bible. I find much more winsome the explanation given by the Jewish scholar Umberto Cassuto. He says, could it not rather be that the biblical writer is wanting to point out to us attributes of God of a particular sort at a particular point in the story? And here, when Yahweh is mentioned, God's interaction tends to be more personal, more immediate, showing more interest in the individual. When God is identified as Elohim, he tends to be a little bit more large or looming or distant. That's a drastic generalization, but it's one that scholars have seen holds true. So Cassuto proposes that what we must guard against is dividing the text and thinking that it came from different writers edited in together later, sort of braided together, when in fact what may have been going on was one writer from the outset who at a particular point in the story wanted us to realize that God was behaving with particular tenderness, particular individual and profound interest, and he helps to send that message to us, the reader, by referring to God by the name Yahweh rather than Elohim. I trust you can see that we may want to give serious consideration to the unitary composition of the Hebrew Bible, since that opens up the possibility of sophisticated composition, employing different terms for God at strategic points in order to alert the reader to a particular flavor or aspect of God which is being displayed at that point. And that's summarized in what you see displayed on the screen now. That reference to Yahweh may indicate a personal relationship within a single unitary source rather than an insertion by an editor working with multiple sources. We're leaving now the literary context and shifting to the theological context. As we ask the question, how is God portrayed in these chapters? In addition to the observation that he continues to be portrayed as creator, chapter 2 of Genesis, here are some other features that occur to us. God is one who supplies companionship. Thinking of the creation of Eve to make sure that the loneliness and the help needed, those features of Adam are brought to fullness. He is a God who himself seeks voluntary relationship. He seeks relationship with humankind, but is to be a voluntary sort, not robots, automatons. He is a God who holds us responsible for our relationships with others. We're thinking here of Cain, responsible for Abel. He's a God who, when we disobey, does bring consequences. Continuing with the character of God displayed in these chapters, he is one who extends mercy. So think of clothing provided for Adam and Eve, and his response to Cain. Even though Cain has taken Abel's life, God does not take Cain's life, but rather banishes him. He is a God who promises rescue in the future. This is a feature we'll want to examine more directly with a scripture passage. Here on the left, you see Genesis 3, beginning with verse 15. Incidentally, I didn't indicate earlier, but this particular Bible software is the Logos Bible software. One of several, and one that I've found very, very useful. So on the left, you see God's statement to the serpent. I will put enmity between you, the serpent, and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. Incidentally, this is a good translation. I like the fact that the two verbs, he will strike and you will strike, are presented in English as the same. I believe I've seen some translations that vary those. Maybe one will use strike and the other crush. In Hebrew, they're the same. So this is a good presentation. Now, this goes by the name. This passage has been named the Proto-Evangelion. Let's go ahead and switch back to the other screen so that you can see that term. This passage has been called the Proto-Evangelion. That's made up of two words, proto meaning first, and evangelion, like the word evangel, means good news, euangelion in Greek. This is the first good news. This is the first announcement that the serpent, the arch enemy of humankind, will eventually be defeated. And he will be defeated not by a strictly supernatural appearance of God, like sending some angel or something like that, but actually someone born of woman. So as persons following God over the centuries have looked at the incarnation and realized what Christ accomplished at the cross in defeating Satan and sin, they see that first prefigured here, the first good news, as early as the same point when there was the onset of human sin and rebellion, right away, God promised that eventually there would come a rescuer. Next, I'm impressed that one of the characteristics of God is his capability to experience grief and pain over evil, and it reaches a high point in Genesis 6:6 as God sees evil becoming rampant and determining this simply must not continue. We've got to stop this. And so he is a God who eventually shuts down wanton violence. Incidentally, some may look at the flood and say, how could God be so harsh? Have you ever seen a situation where people who are innocent, and particularly people who are young, people who are very young, are suffering at the hands of others? Or perhaps you've heard a story of cruelty that is lashing out against the defenseless, the poor, the weak, and the young. I can't help but wonder if God saw so much of that going on. He said, I've got to stop this. And so the cessation, God's intervention, was keeping such cruelty from being perpetuated. The flood may look harsh, and yes, certainly it was widespread. But there may be mercy in that he prevented persons from suffering cruelty at the hands of others whom they could not resist. That's an interpretive comment. It's not something explicit in the passage. Last on this page, then, we find God within these chapters as a person who engages in a covenant, a solemn promise, like a contract. This will be the first covenant recorded in Scripture. It is with Noah. It consists of his promise not to employ the flood again. To be a little more accurate, the covenant was established with all creatures as well, not just with humans. And now let's turn to humankind, asking the theological question, what is it about humans that we can learn and their interaction with God? The unique worth of male and female is presented within Genesis 2. Also the establishment of marriage. Marriage as consisting of a permanent union between a man and a woman. We also learn the divisive effect of disobedience on the relationship with God and relationships with each other. Recall how it propelled Adam and Eve away from God's presence so that he had to come looking for them, a divisive effect of their disobedience. And then within their own relationship, we see that humans are affected with disunity and the tendency to blame each other when they engage in sin. Curse and pain and hardship flow from disobedience and eventual return to the soil from which you were made, the demise of death. Continuing with humankind, we see from the story of Cain and Abel and God's words to Cain before he committed murder that he held Cain responsible to resist temptation. A simple concept, but so plainly put forth in this story. His words to Cain, you must control, you must overpower this temptation to sin. We see that humans also are in need of restoration. We are in a condition that is not as originally designed. We are in need of being restored across the board. We also sadly see that left on our own, there is an inclination towards increased brutality toward each other, and frankly, we could include self-harm as well, for all rebellion at its foundation consists of self-harm too. Let's turn now, as we wrap up this study of Genesis 2 to 10, to consider how this can impact our lives. There are a variety of things that can come to mind. Here are a few of them. We've seen marriage introduced. Consequently, it's an encouragement, a reminder to cherish and honor the marital relationship. Those of us who are married or considering it, keep marriage on a very high pedestal of value. Be alert to strategies of the enemy, notice how the enemy works. He will work to undermine our relationship with God by raising questions about the reliability, the truthfulness of what God has said. And then he will increase the wrongful appeal or attractiveness of things that God has said are not right for us. He will also undermine our relationship with a spouse, with a brother, people close to us. We want to be alert to these strategies in order to counteract them. And then recalling chapter 6, verse 9, after the flood, when God said, you're responsible. If you take a human life, you're responsible for having done that. We want to commit ourselves to safeguard life as well. And this wraps up our study of Genesis 2 through 10. Next, we'll take up chapter 11.